welcome to another edition of Secrets from the Ancient Past. Thanks for joining us. I'm Andy Cook. We're starting a new series today called The Search for God's Own Heart. We're going to take a very visual dive into the life of David and try to discover what made him, and what could give us a chance to be, a person after God's own heart. Now, the journey for David began in Bethlehem. For followers of Jesus, no trip to Israel seems complete without a visit to Bethlehem. This, after all, is where Jesus was born. Today, Bethlehem is a crowded city and predominantly a Muslim community in makeup. That represents a big shift of the local population. In 1947, just 1 year before the new state of Israel came into existence, 84% of the population in Bethlehem was Christian. But today, only 16% is Christian, with 85% being Muslim. That's a complete demographic reversal in less than 100 years. Still, it's Christian tourists who keep coming to Bethlehem, all of them wanting to see the place where Jesus was born. And they'll find the traditional location of the birthplace inside the Church of the Nativity. But while you're in Bethlehem, pay attention to your tour guides. They will remind you that the house of bread, Beit Lechem, has a rich biblical history. By the time Jacob returned to the Promised Land with his growing family, his wife Rachel was expecting her second child. She went into labor and gave birth to Benjamin near Bethlehem. Tragically, she died in childbirth and was buried near the community. Ever after, Rachel became something of a patron saint for any woman who knew the pain of losing a child. In fact, more than 14 centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah used Rachel's pain to describe the horrible scene he had witnessed in Jerusalem during the destruction of the great city. Jeremiah said, "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." Likewise, when Matthew wrote about the Christmas story, he quoted Jeremiah's lament as a way to describe the horror of Herod's slaughter of infants after he heard that the Messiah had been born in Bethlehem. It was as if Rachel was weeping yet again in a village that had known far too much pain involving young children. On a much happier note, there's also the story of Ruth, the Moabite woman who came to Bethlehem to care for her mother-in-law, Naomi. It was in the fields of Bethlehem where Ruth first found the joy of God's great provision. First, there was food and shelter, and then there was love. She and Boaz married, and their story has never been forgotten. Ruth and Boaz are a big part of Bethlehem's great biblical history. But it's Ruth's great-great-grandson who brings us here today. His name was David, and he became the greatest king in Israel's history. Even better, the Bible gave him an intriguing title. For David became known as a man after God's own heart. Samuel gave David that title, speaking on behalf of God himself. You know, Jesus also speaks honorably of David on several occasions. And in the book of Acts, it's obvious that the first followers of Jesus held to the lofty concept that David was indeed a man after God's own heart. I've spent many years studying David's life and even written a book about the search for God's own heart. I've been amazed at this book's success, for we've sold more copies of this little book than any other book I've ever written. I think there are a lot of us who would like to be known as people after God's own heart. There are a lot of us who would like to hope that imperfect people like us can still be in a right relationship with God. David's imperfections? Indeed. Maybe that's why we resonate so much with David. For if you know his story, you know David made lots of mistakes. Politically, he was king, but he really wasn't the best political leader Israel ever had. As an economic leader, he couldn't hold a candle to Solomon's wealth. As a person of international influence, well, there were many other kings who had much more influence with other world leaders in that time period. However, on a spiritual level, David is among the best examples in all the Bible of what it means to be a righteous person. on his best days, he sang amazing songs about the glory of God. You think about David's impact. We are still singing some of the songs he wrote 3,000 years later. We're still using some of his phrases of worship in new songs of worship today. On the other hand, well, on his worst days, David committed adultery and murder, and he went to great lengths to cover up his crimes. There was no excuse for his sin, and there seemed to be no end of it. Like a lot of us, David was on a spiritual roller coaster. He was very, very good, and he was very, very bad. Even so, Jesus speaks of him as if David never did anything wrong. People still hold David up as Israel's greatest king. He will always be known not for what he did wrong, but for what he got right. And that's why this is so important. If there's hope for David to be a man after God's own heart, there's hope for me, there's hope for you, there's hope for us. If God had grace and forgiveness waiting for a man who made so many mistakes, then grace and forgiveness is available for all of us. In the next few weeks, we'll spend a few episodes chasing down, again, what it means to be a person after God's own heart. I hope you'll join me in the journey. And as we put a pause button on this effort today, I'll share with you what I think is the number one reason David was called a man after God's own heart. You ready? David wanted to be in a right relationship with God. From his youngest days to his oldest years, David desperately wanted to be known as a man who loved God. He wanted to know God. He wanted to be known by God. When he sinned, and when he was confronted with that sin, he repented without any excuses. When he sang, he gave it everything he had. When he prayed as if God himself was listening. And you know what? God was listening. And God will listen to you and to me too. If you're searching for an amazing relationship with God, tell him. Confess your sin and throw off anything that hinders your passion for worship. Somewhere in the process, I'll bet we can find exactly what we're looking for. And I want to thank you again for joining me in the search for God's own heart. I'll see you next time. I'm Andy Cook.